Welcome. Bruchim habayim. I'm Jenny Roberge, Chair of Limmud Ottawa, and on behalf of the Limmud team, thank you for joining us to our first virtual Limmud. We are privileged to have partnered with the varied Jewish Canadian Study Program at the University of Ottawa to bring you Shira Tzfonit, Northern Poetry, a very special anthology of Jewish Canadian poetry. Limmud warmly welcomes our four poets, Karen Shenfeld, Rona Shaffran, B.Glen, Rotchin, and Seymour Mayne. We want to thank Seymour Mayne for giving us an opportunity to turn our gaze away from the disruptions and upheavals of the pandemic by reminding us that poetry, and here specifically Jewish Canadian poetry, beckons not so distant memories of an uprooted and of a displaced people. The poetry grew out of the need to unpack Jewish culture and poetry grew out of the need to unpack Jewish culture and Jewish experience and to put it into words. Jewish poetry is a form of a virtual home where you can unload and engage the words that tell our stories, the stories of others, and the stories we heard as a people. We hope you enjoy this program. Before we start, there are a few things I wanted to remind you. We want you to use the chat on the screen, but remember, it is going to be visible to all. And at the end of the four readings, there will be a Q&A. When asking a question, when you write the question, please name the poet who you are addressing. And we hope to get as many questions as the time allows. The closed captioning can be enabled and disabled by clicking the closed caption button located on the bottom of your screens. The program is being recorded and will be uploaded on the Limmud website, where you will also find the bios and the work links of our participating poets. So without any further delay, I am honored to introduce our host, poet, author, visionary, Limmudnik, and a dear friend, Seymour Mayne.
Thank you, Jenny. And welcome to everyone. Bienvenue, bruchim habayim. Jenny asked me why I came up with this idea. Two things. Up to about the 1990s, poetry was the premier literary genre in Canada. And over the past 20 years, it somehow fell beneath the cultural radar. Not reviewed too often in the newspapers or the media, but the poets continued to write, many poets. Jewish Canadian poetry, 36 years ago, I released an anthology, the most comprehensive of Jewish Canadian poetry, called Essential Words. I haven't updated it in 36 years, but in 36 years, there have been a host of poets who've joined the Canadian literary community from the Jewish community, and it was time to do something about it. So the first step will be to create this online anthology, and then perhaps later another print anthology following on Essential Words. Varied program at the University of Ottawa is very pleased to work with Limmud, which, as most of you know, is a transnational organization of groups and volunteers who promote Jewish learning in all kinds of venues and places around the world. And the Varied Jewish Canadian Studies program is the only program of its kind that focuses on the Jewish community of Canada, its contribution to art, literature, government, business, politics, law, whatever. We are the only one, a complete program devoted to the Jewish community and its contribution. So today I have a group of very fine writers who've been publishing for quite some time. Our first reader is Karen Shenfeld, who's published a number of books, who for many years lived in Toronto, but now lives in a wonderful shtetl in Muskoka with beautiful views of rivers and lakes. And she's the only one of us who can be called a rural Jewish Canadian poet at the moment, because the rest of us are still urban writers. You can look up more information about her, and you can also do a search, and you can also find poems of hers online. But right now, I'm really pleased to welcome Karen right now to begin her reading. Please, Karen.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me, Seymour. I'm just delighted to be here this afternoon. I'm going to begin with a poem called The Standing Prayer. In Hebrew, it would be, of course, the Amida. Menachem prays standing in a warm rectangle of light. Israel prays with his eyes closed, the pages of his pearled book turning in the breeze of his breath. Nathan prays out loud, his recitation, a river washing over polished stones. Yussi races to the 19th blessing, eager to sit down. Abraham stumbles over the syllables' twisting roots. As Nehemiah prays, the crocheted halo of his yarmulke slips from the crown of his head. Kalman prays, stroking his red beard. David prays, shifting his weight from foot to foot, a fighter dodging invisible blows. Oren prays beside his father, the fringes of his prayer shawl almost touching the ground. Shaul prays near the door, the 10th man, closing the circle. I pray where I cannot tempt and cannot be counted, my praises and petitions, my thanks, heard or not heard, as all the rests. Well, I was very privileged that my mother was an excellent storyteller, and she told me wonderful stories about her childhood, about her parents. This poem is for her grandmother, Chaya, for whom I'm named, and who my mother told me about. And it's called The Law of Return. I try to remember things I could have never known to forget. The world reduced, expanded to a green and yellow kitchen. Dusted linen clothed the table. She braided dough like tresses of her granddaughter's hair, fired sesame freckled loaves that rose to be blessed. Chaya. My mother remembered jet waves, bow legs, false teeth. Cherry vishnek in a cellar of spiders and coal. Thursday evening, she walked to Kensington, claimed her chicken live from a wooden crate, cool as the shochet's prayer, feathers blown in the blue-orange flame of a torch. My mother at the table watched her weed, heart, lungs, gizzard, stuff scrubbed derma, a white glistening worm turned inside out like a sock. Chaya, I invoke your name that catches the back of the throat like a bone. I want to tell you, the law of return has brought me back to a red brick house. These rooms, like those rooms you kept on Dundas Street, whose washed walls hold still the scent of roses, hardwood shudders under footsteps of the dead. I don't know the time it takes for dough to rise, Friday's candles to burn down to the wick. I look through panes that flow like tears, watch rosettes drifting across a plaster sky, taller than a chapel's, no ladder can reach. It is told. 2 children lost, my booby Risha feared the angel of death. Her third breathing waters, crowding her swollen womb, she turned her kerchiefed head, saw him walking the streets of Minsk, tall as the world is round, from the crown of his head to the soles of his feet, studded with glaring eyes. So when she labored and brought forth a son, the Rav said, "Let him be called Altar. Let him be clothed in a burial shroud, white as rain." Well, my lovely niece, Carly, has had a baby just a month or 2 ago, and she's sending me lots of wonderful pictures of the baby. Her name is Audrey. And these pictures made me think a lot about when I had my own son, Oren. So I'm going to read a couple of poems inspired by him. The first one, Circumcision. I should light candles in every room, burn incense, chant, lie awake, the knife's gleam snuffed under a weight of clouds. Danger demands such precautions. I do not sleep, cradle him close, walk the hall with deliberate step, sway of hip, a dance or march to mock the rock of remembered seas. Dawn, I will lay a table with linen, candlesticks, a goblet of wine. Set aside a prophet's chair, stand aside as he's passed from man to man. I breathe now into ears, small, curled as shells. Draw consolation from the notion of a pact until his starlit cry calls me back. The mafter. As a diamond needle draws the flame of music from a spinning disc, the silver tip of his pointer brings forth his cantillation. So the wave of his darkening voice breaks on foaming rock, lifts the words one by one from the scroll. Over the heads of the congregation, their crowned letters dance, drifting home toward the ark. In my second book, The Fertile Crescent, I wrote a number of poems in the voice of Sarah, Abraham's wife. I'm going to read you one of them. The images in the poem, though, are not from my imagination. The images, a lot of them, are from actually a trip I took in 1987 where I hitchhiked across the Sahara Desert. Seymour didn't say this about me, but I love traveling and have done a great deal. And of course, that's something I've really been missing in the pandemic. So here's one of the poems I wrote for Sarah. Take thou thy son, thine only son. Walls trembled, submitting to the wind's hard hand. The winds flushed themselves, each gust a whirling terrible gin. And between the gusts, the mountains thunderclaps as rocks, ice-veined, split raw. How could you sleep? All night, hooves trod the cracked earth, your herds fugue, darkening to a dirge. Farther off, fennec twitched, burrowed deep, the ibex's nervous dart. All night I watched your chest rise and fall, the poisonous fumes of your dreams escape your dried, open mouth. And beside you, the flesh of our flesh in repose. Lashed to your waist sash, your dagger pulsed. Only the fear of God stayed my hand. The ironical stars looked on and on. Well, I think we need a change of pace. So here's a poem set in the neighborhood of Toronto in which I was raised, Bathurst Manor. How the golem of Bathurst Manor came to be. And so they met at midnight. Rebbe Yehuda, the revered one, Yitzchak, his favorite son-in-law, farm assistant, thanks be to God, learned Kohen, Yaakov the Levite, acolyte from the Thursday night class. I am air, Rabbi Yehuda said. Yitzchak, you are fire, and you, Yaakov, are water. All we need now is earth. Yes, twigs snapped and scratched, and birds clung to their whitened robes and beards, as beneath a waxing moon they trod, Rabbi Yehuda, Yitzchak, then Yaakov, single file down the ravine's muddy path to the banks. Not the Moldau, but the river Don. How many nights had they fasted and prayed? How many nights had they sat awake as the book of creation opened its gates? And so it came to pass. Of clay they sculpted it, and chanted and circled and bowed. And Rebbe Yehuda inscribed the ineffable name upon its brow. And though you think all this might be but a dream or half-remembered tale, tomorrow at morning services, look closer round. He's the tall, silent one, long hair, love beads, an embroidered Indian shirt and jeans, the draft dodger up from New York State. He sits in seat 20, row C, head bowed, holding his prayer book backwards and upside down. And here's a poem for my mother's father, who I did get to meet, though he died when I was a child, but I knew him. Theater doctor. My Zadie knew the show must go on. He was their top banana, Anne, Georgia, Marjorie, Sally, Gypsy too. The great girls who gave the boys the business. The burlesque house again, Bobby asked dismayed, suspecting foul play. Sadie gave his lemon tea a final sip, brushed moon cookie crumbs from flecked mustaches, exited on cue, toting his black leather bag like a prop. Inured to the charms of feminine flesh, he swam backstage with nary a sidelong glance, the palest blush, through schools of chorus girls, soubrettes, shedding spangles, the dust of stars. He cured their ailments, great and small, painted Gypsy's tender throat, corseted the tiger girl's lower lumbar, daubed mercurochrome upon Sally's breast, her wound accidental, an ostrich feather's errant quill. I heard it said it was he who bandaged the wings of Zarita's doves, the bloodied nose of Rose La Rose. Admitted to private chambers, he witnessed transformations, the polishing of nature's gifts. What more was he privy to? Spats with boyfriends, managers, secret longings, fears. Of this I cannot tell. He was silenced by an ancient oath, the discretion of a temperate soul. And I'm going to read you one last poem before I hand over the mic. My father's hands spoke in Yiddish, the ganze Megillah of curses, complaints. Ever in motion, they argued with themselves. Geh kochen off in Yum, my father's hands said. Go shit in the sea. In the Mammal Ocean, they spoke their last impatient words. Rose palms up from the narrow bed. New, shoin, all right already. Then fell like bricks. Their final fetch, bemusing the angel of death. Well, thank you so much. I'm ready to hand over the mic, and I'm so looking forward to hearing everyone else read to you today.
Thank you, Karen. That was lovely. And you introduced a whole set of images and themes that I'm sure are going to be picked up in other poets, the other poems, being read by the other poets. And so we didn't collude to write our poems separately, but what's interesting is the echoes amongst all the poets, which you, the listeners now, will hear and enjoy. Our next reader is Rona Shaffran, who was born in Montreal. Rona published a very well-received collection of poems, and I know, I'll let the secret out, she's working on a novel, parts of which I've read, which I'm really looking forward, because I'm following the exploits of the characters, month by month, and I'm really eager to hear it. Rona, for many years, worked for the mother of all employers, the Civil Service of Canada. And that gave her an added perspective on, I'm sure, both the comedy and the absurdity of life. Rona, please take the mic.
Seymour, thank you for that charming and warm introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm honored, so honored to be reading here this afternoon alongside three very fine poets. First, some very warm thank yous to Seymour for your invitation and for all the work you did in making today happen. To Limmud Ottawa, to you, Jenny, to your committee, to Alexandre and his technical team, and to the very Jewish Canadian Studies program, University of Ottawa, for presenting the session. And to each one of you for zooming in. After all, it is with your presence that poetry can come alive, can come off the page. And so we'll begin. The first few poems I read will speak of the bond between the individual and the Jewish nation. We start with a poem titled Named. It's inspired by a moment in Israel, and it borrows a line from the American poet Mark Strand, and that line is, even this late, the bones of the body shine. Named. Last stop on the tour, we are in Hebron, in Israel. Inside the walls built by Herod the Great, the floor stones worn and cold under my feet. The guide lectures that we, the Jewish people, originate from Abraham and Sarah, their son Isaac, his wife Rebecca, their grandson Jacob and his wife Leah, all buried, it said, in secret chambers beneath us, here in the cave of Machpelah, the entrance to their dust sealed off by a large square stone. To right and left of the corridor we walk, Their red and white monuments rise high above me, draped in tapestries of forest and lime green. The names etched on brass plaques in Hebrew I cannot read. How could it be true, I have often asked, that Abraham reasoned there is but one God, with whom he entered into a covenant, and who commanded he go forth to the Holy Land to be forefather of the Jewish people? The crowd disperses, and I am left standing alone between Abraham and Sarah, when a breeze warms my skin. The trace of a trace, their ancient breath, a living breath, and the bones of their bodies shine, and their dust names me. I have found great beauty in the Negev, and on our last trip, we visited the Arava Desert in the southeast. Arava Desert in spring. Brown buttes jut from the desert floor, their summits wind-chiseled terraces bleached as bone. Slabs of limestone stacked like vertebrae of the earth brace the heights and fall away to gully-lined slopes, plummeting into dust-filled craters gouged by parched riverbeds studded with bare slabs of rock. Yet, after the gush of this morning, brief spring rain, clusters of bright red anemones bloom in every crevice of the rock under my feet. The silence shimmers. The diaphanous azure sky illuminates the land in lucid light, and I know the breath of my life is here in this sanctuary of dust among the pillars of stone. I am struck by the following lines from Exodus. And all the people saw the voices and the torches, the sound of the shofar and the smoking mountain, and the people saw and trembled and stood from afar. In these lines, the nation stood at Sinai in such a heightened state that they saw what is normally heard and they heard what is normally seen. That section of Exodus inspired my next poem. Altar of uncut stone. I will make for you an altar of uncut stone at the foot of the smoking mountain. Let me hear the fog that billows from thick cloud and glimpse the burst of thunder in the flaming rock. I will make for you an altar of uncut stone. Let me listen to the tinge of fire and gaze at the three piercing blasts of the ram's horn. Let me tremble. Two themes can be seen in my next few poems. First, how Jewish time folds in on itself. Past, present, and future intermingle, as we'll soon see with our Passover Seders, as just one of many such examples. We have one foot in the past, one in the present, and one in the future. And the second theme we'll hear are the themes of loss and sorrow, which Judaism handles so brilliantly and so sensitively, and how that loss can move us from darkness to light. Aaron's left arm. You had to be smarter than the guy beside you, Aaron says. They tattooed A11310 on the inside of my left arm. I was strong, selected for work, not the gas chamber. Look how faded the numbers are now, all wrinkled. I'm 85. I was 13 then, prisoner in Auschwitz 1.5 years. Sarah and I, we met there. We got married afterwards. She bought me long sleeve shirts to cover up my skin. I met Frances after Sarah died 12 years ago. Just last night, she ran her fingers down my arm and caressed my tattoo. Glide. This past November, in my side yard, I teetered across a patch of ice, and that ice called me child. In boys' scratched brown skates my father borrowed, my ankles bend over, clomping on the patch he'd flooded overnight. Skate over to me, he says, his arms wide. I zigzag to him. Again, he says, and I glide into his smile. The year the ambulance took him away. Four-sided story. I was too young, my mother said, to attend my father's funeral. She sat shiva for him on a gray metal chair in our living room. Visitors brought her tuna casseroles, long roasted chicken, salmon patties, and apple cake. From the next room, I watched my mother sitting on her gray metal chair. Each year, on the day of my father's death, my mother, my sister, and I lit the yahrzeit candle. When my mother passed, my sister and I sat shiva for her on our gray metal chairs. And every year, when we lit the yahrzeit candle, my sister whipped up our mother's chocolate fudge. Now, I have lost my sister, and with her, our private language. Fee, I called her, till we giggled and were young girls again. The only one left now to remember the four of us, anchoring the chrome legs of our cherry red kitchen table. I am the last voice of our four-sided story on my gray metal chair. The next poem borrows a line from the American poet Emily Dickinson, and the line is, "We grow accustomed to the dark." Brief light nocturne. It was late summer, and the evenings already cold, when the alarm clanged 3:00 a.m., and wearing hats and gloves against the hour, we scrambled the path to the river's edge, giggling into the black maw of the night. All this happened long before I almost lost you, when your trajectory stuttered in its fleeting radiance. After a time, our vision accustomed to the dark, we stood, our necks bent backwards, and counted 150 bits of interplanetary rubble fired by friction shoot through the shivering firmament in showers of flaming tails, and as quickly vaporize into the long night. Where no light can enter. Tangerine and gold nasturtium petals nestled in 2 window boxes at the entrance to my grandparents' White House. And in their side yard, my sister and I perched on a gnarled chokecherry limb, feasting on handfuls of wild raspberries, our fingers ruby red. The weathered wooden gate at the side of my own White House clicks closed, and I am gathered in by a phalanx of pine green cedars where, in their shaded interior, nasturtium tendrils nimbly thread a gray chaos of twisting branches and twigs. There, where no light can enter, the tangerine and gold blossoms still bloom. 2 questions. She bounces into view from behind raspberry bushes by the high trestle I crossed as a child. 12 years old, auburn flecked brown hair, a daisy chain around her neck. I wave to her, her arms hang at her waist. Unblinking, peering at me, she asks, "What are you most proud of in your life? What did you learn when you made a mistake?" I tell her. She skips over to me, arms outstretched, vanishes into my skin and emerges in back of me, walking into her future and my past. A poem can be triggered by just about anything. The next one came to me when we were vacationing by the ocean. I had woken up very early and sat down on the floor beside my dog, whose name is Yuffie. In this poem, you'll find a connectedness between that not usually seen as connected. Atonement Obad. I wake at dawn to a pastel sun. I stretch out on the burnt orange carpet beside my golden retriever, my right hand on her ribcage and my left on my own. In the rise of her chest and the fall of mine, we breathe a single thanksgiving of breath in a choir of the house sparrow at dawn and the bark of yesterday's whiskered seal, in a oneness that drenches the parched skin of the universe, that plumps the black purple bramble bush, that engorges the redwood trunk into exclamations of the earth, a oneness where the bare winter maple branches vascular, and where my sins, silhouetted like the sunlit shadows of leaf on leaf, empty like seeds from a cracked pod. Sip of water here. And now I'd like to read you a poem that reimagines the biblical words, go forth. Can you? Can you leave your land of closed windows where the familiar views clump around you like a bowl of milk-soaked shreddies? Can you go from your land of beige? Can you go to the new land you will show you? Maybe to windows that open to a cobalt sea and a weathered red rowboat? Can you go to yourself? I've always loved looking at trees, but I only recently learned they play an important role in Jewish thought. For example, in a midrash, there is a phrase, because a man and a woman are each trees of the field, teaching that our life is from the tree, without which we would not have the oxygen to sustain us. So here for you are two poems on the theme of trees. Beat. A fresh wind propels me down a maple-lined path. Autumn's amber leaves oscillate in the breeze, their veins gilded with light. Crumpled leaves fall into ground, cavort with each other, caper across gleaming grass, caress a tree trunk twisted into human form, while in feathered cues, lime green bushes bend as one to an unseen hand. And my heart beats. From my window, glazed with snow, striped black and white as a dazzle of zebras, the limbs of winter elms, I had a tech thing here. The limbs of winter elms crisscross like human bronchi. Just a moment here. Okay, I'm just gonna get my, I'm better to start this. I'll start this one over. From my window, glazed with snow, striped black and white as a dazzle of zebras, the limbs of winter elms crisscross like human bronchi, inhaling our outbreath, exhaling our inbreath, as their trunks rise with living sap. Thank you once again for being here and for listening. Back to Seymour.
Sorry, Seymour, you are muted.
Technical difficulties. I'm convinced that when we have a Jewish Canadian reading, we don't get leprechauns, we get leprechauns that come in from Ireland to to stir up trouble. I'm thanking Rona for a lovely reading, and those experiences which she writes, they'll find echo in poems by the other poets. They're also echoes you'll find in your own experience because of the very, very well-crafted words as you found in both poets who read to date, to now. The third poet is Glen Rotchin from Montreal. Glen has talents in two main genres, poetry and novel. He's published 2 novels, and I urge you to read his novels as you read the books of the other poets as well, and also his poems, which will come out in chapbooks and in joint publications. He worked for a time at the Jewish Public Library in Montreal, but for many, many years now, he is really a rather anomalous figure in Jewish Canadian letters. He is a property manager in the Shmata district of Montreal, and that gives him a very special distinction. Glen.
Thank you, Seymour. When Seymour asked me to participate in this, I was excited, with a little trepidation, but I thought to myself, what could I offer to the participants of a Limmud event? I want to thank obviously the organizers of Limmud for this opportunity, but I thought it had to be something associated with Limmud. So I wanted to read something that was a tribute to some of our more important poets, Jewish Canadian poets. This was an anthology of Jewish Canadian poetry, and the first name that came to mind, of course, was Abraham Moses Klein, known as A.M. Klein. I want to say a word about this first reading, which is quite long, but it is a tribute to A.M. Klein. If you don't know who A.M. Klein is, shame on you, you should. Abraham Moses Klein was the Dean of Jewish Canadian Letters, I would say, born in 1909, and he died in 1972. He was truly a master of the English language in all its written forms. He was a poet, a novelist, an essayist, a speechwriter, and an editor. He was the winner of the 1948 Governor General's Award for Poetry for his collection, The Rocking Chair and Other Poems. And Seymour, our esteemed Seymour, wrote the afterword for A.M. Klein's only novel, which was called The Second Scroll. It was published in 1951, and Seymour wrote the afterword for the New Canadian Library edition, obviously not the original edition, the New Canadian Library edition. So I wanted to read you something about this writing, this piece that I wrote, which is a kind of prose poem, but it's actually an imagined journal entry written shortly after Abraham Moses Klein finished writing The Second Scroll. And in the novel, his last words of the novel are actually a quotation from the Psalm 30. So it's King David. And he writes, "Never be silent." He writes the words, "Never be silent." And what's peculiar about Klein was essentially these were his last published words. And for 18 years following the publication of The Second Scroll, he was silent. He actually gave public readings and he taught, but in publication, he was silent. So the irony of him quoting King David, the Psalms, saying, "Never be silent," is one of the things that inspired this. And this was, I'm essentially taking on his voice and trying to continue his writing. So I'm imagining what his other written words might be and why he was silent for 18 years. This is something that's haunted writers, Jewish Canadian writers, for many, many, many years and generations, really. And the other inspiration for this piece, incidentally, was that my mother-in-law actually lived next door to the Kleins when they lived on Hutchison in Montreal. And my mother-in-law, Margie Schwartzman, at the time Schwartzman, she became Margie Black, told me that she heard Bessie Klein, A.M. Klein's wife, typing out manuscripts. She could hear it at night because Bessie was his typist. So that was echoing in my mind, and also the idea that there was this irony to the last words that he wrote. So I'm going to read this piece called Unwriting Myself. I'll just read the beginning. It was actually originally published in 2002 to mark the 30th anniversary of A.M. Klein's death. It was, in fact, my first attempt at writing fiction. I've written 2 novels since. And it attempts to, as I say, imagine what he might have been thinking as he finished writing the last lines of that novel, Unwriting Myself, from the imagined journal of A.M. Klein, August 1950. To the end that my glory may sing praise to thee and not be silent. O Lord, my God, I will give thanks unto thee forever. What more is there to say? And where exactly have I arrived? To praise God, is that the only thing to do? Then what if this scroll unrolled, come to an end, a stop, a period, truth be told, an emptiness, a silence? We're still a question. Either God is or is not, and not another praise, nor curse, nor word, nor punctuation will suffice to conjure his presence. Bessie is in the living room typing the last of it. Her tacking behind the wall insults the quiet. It intrudes as a Morse code of desperation and helplessness, fills the cold night air along Curbs Avenue with the insistent SOSing of a sinking ship. Faces appear out of the bookshelf. I hear the quickly fading cries of ice-filled lungs, tongues swollen stiff. God, when will you arrive to save us? How shall we open our blue lips to sing your praise? What praise will do? I brought you music and poetry, danced before you like King David, turning shame to honor in your name, debased myself in some eyes, feeling lifted aloft on wings of divine egolessness. As I write this, Jerusalem quakes and the ark of your new old state totters as it always has. I will not try to write it, refuse to repeat well-known mistakes. How can I go on stumbling toward your dream like a biblical ox? I did your bidding, cursed the community its golden calves. Now I am weary, my mind is shattered like your famous 10 words. My hiding place has always been the rock, a craggy formation of words. I have seen you pass the back of your head, but it is not enough right now. Oh God, reveal yourself, show yourself, full-faced, panim el panim. Let me know the secrets behind the words, those secrets for which Akiva was martyred, stripped of his skin, layer from layer. His insides become outsides, the outer his inner being, and he was indistinguishable from meaning itself, from Torah, from pure spirit. His torture was his liberation. You revealed yourself to my predecessor, that master of letters, and now I ask the same for me. Even as we speak, I feel the parchment of myself peeling away, unscrolling, twisting to the floor. I must admit that the glory I sought all along was not yours, but mine. The song was for myself, my own edification. The beauty I pursued was an investment on which I expected a respectable return, to see my words make a difference, to hear the hosannas of my peers, my community. Thus was your name made profane. Words are false. Even the choicest, sweetest ones, mere illusions, constructions of how we want to appear, the mark we want to leave. But these cannot matter. Only you are eternal. You stunned Job into silent awe, contrasting the narrow boundaries of his mortal existence with the limitlessness of creation. Suddenly he realized that the indivisible, unfathomable laws which govern the movements of nature are also sovereign over the individual. Reality is not the content of tiny personal claims. It is a sweeping continuum, undeniable as it is unchangeable, fluid and shifting as tidal consciousness. What are we? Long extinguished stars that appear as luminous traces of our own deaths. The ghost writer is ghost. The poet is landscape. If life is form, then death is content. Could this be your secret? the one exposed with the great Akiva's final revelation, his body opening like a many-petaled flower for the morning sun? Every creative act is simultaneously a death sentence. The artist seeks but one thing, the perfect union of form and content. Enraptured by the sounds, smells, tastes, and visions of the world, he delights in his corporeal being. He thinks corporeality equivalent to reality, ultimate being, and thereby idolizes the material. But no incarnation of the material confuse form with content in an unending embrace of humankind and divinity. Only in the denial of the material, of materiality and corporeality, can essence surface like a submerged bath escape. Only in the liquid buoyancy of transparent selflessness can the pure self rise to you in wholeness. And so every word I write and ever wrote is leaden, sinking, an umbrous stain, every letter a shadow footprint on a snowy page. I have espoused, opined, editorialized, rhapsodized, mused, debated, and analyzed with only one goal in mind, to shape a self, a somebody. But arguments are a wardrobe for fools. To think that one can create oneself from the costumes of idea and utterance. At their best, words are amusements, avoidances, diversions from the singular truth. These repulsive skins I have grown must go, must be shed. These disguises of selfhood I've spent a lifetime concocting and justifying with cleverness and craft must be effaced. There is only one question, one formulation, one equation. Either God is or is not. I am not God. God is, and so I am not. The bureau is swept clean. 2 erasers on the corner, like pebbles on a hardly visited headstone. There's also a teacup and saucer. Below the cup's rim, a thin golden line like a horizon. Fingers reach for the handle's seraphic curl, a letter flourish, an ear's outer curve. The hand and cup do not meet. They are held in time and space between being and not being. And this is where God sees fit to leave them, suspended in grace. Klein, reading Klein's poems, I mean, he was a master of many, many forms, certainly the greatest poet, Jewish Canadian poet, and possibly the greatest Jewish writer of the English language, and he was a master of forms. So he inspired me to write sonnets, and one of the first sonnets I ever wrote was to him, and was a tribute to him, and I'm going to read 2 sonnets now. First one called Abraham Moses. North of the former Yiddish theater, gate and railing perform, mimic, pirouette, soar, black twists of wrought iron do Hasid horas to storied heights. They serif stretch, punctuate the urban sprawl like ketubah script, ornate. Obscured through white veil of snow, the bridled doors and porches seem like rows of peddler horses. The main is dowry or else bequeathed estate immemorial. Here, Abraham Moses was wedded to his past, imbibed lush doses from an heirloom Kiddush cup. Ever the proud bridegroom and linguistically well endowed, he vowed his eternal soul true and loyal under raised cross-peaked chuppah of Mount Royal. And this is another sonnet, and this one is to somebody we're all familiar with, another inspiration of mine, The Barefoot Poet for Seymour Mayne. I'll draw your attention to the end rhymes because they're a little bit unusual, intentionally unusual. So take a look at the end rhymes of the poem. The Barefoot Poet. There pray your patient shoes, toes to the wall, where once the prophets sanctified the law. While here, barefoot, you pace your frigid ward, musing on Torah texts from which to draw your craft. Right on, Ottawa's Jewish bard. Set the capital sky so winter drab, ablaze with your lightning Yiddish wit. Brag of your inheritance. Let Hebrew garb warm your stark English prose, and let verse flow from your pen like a Rito thaw. Your wolf pack of students circles as round a deer, or as lips tightening round a still reed, hungry for your keen song, a song that peels the eyelids from men in lame, vacant sleep. I'll read two more poems. This one is actually a recent one. Noah. This dreary rain-soaked Monday in late October, a reading of Noah lingering in the mind, and the question asked by the rabbis, whether he was truly righteous or just righteous enough in a very wicked generation. They can't seem to decide. And I ask myself why everything has to be relative in this world that floats like a life raft in black space, riding up and down waves of good and evil, this overloaded boat muling with vestiges of the living collected in twos, each asking him, herself, why, and the heavens opening with the answer, why not? And my final poem, something very different, a little bit of humor, hopefully, called Junk Email. It arrives whether you want it or not, slips in through an unseen slot, like so much else in life. And you've learned how to set up a filter that strains the unexpected and unwanted from the desirable, identifies and files it in a separate folder for eventual deletion. Junk email reminds you of the forces at work behind the scenes, reminds you that there are no real boundaries in this world. Junk email tells you that ultimately there is nothing you can do to stem the flow, that no power exists to make you impervious to the tap, tap, tap of certain leaks. The girls named Charlene and Celine who want to meet, the offers of discount Viagra and Cialis, the secrets of penis enlargement, and the many ways to earn $500 per week in your spare time. Junk email teaches you to read between the lines, and that more than anything, what you really want is to believe, because there's a hole in the center of the universe. Oh, and your Hotmail account needs updating. Junk email is a fortune cookie. Open it at your peril. Junk email reminds you you're an addict. Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn, for the variety of work that you offered us. And I will be answering that poem of yours, actually, by coincidence, one of the poems I'm going to read. So now I have the pleasure of introducing myself, which there's a little biography of me on the site that you can read. I should say, in the choice of poems that I chose, out of the many poems I've written, I wanted to give some kind of reflection on the fact that I grew up in a particular community, the Montreal Jewish community in the 1940s and 50s, the school I went, the library, which is a very important institute in my formation, and one of the great proud moments of my life when I was pre-bar mitzvah, I was already an adult member of the Jewish Public Library, where all kinds of things happened. And one day I met the husband of one of the librarians, the great Yiddish poet Melech Ravitch. We sat and talked in English. And years later, I wrote an elegy for him. For Melech Ravitch, 1893-1976. Who can forget your dignified manner, your cane and soft smile, and the words you offer the bristling and critical youth? That spring day, both of us stood before the larger-than-life painting of the barricade, Warsaw Ghetto tableau at the Jewish Public Library. About what continually corrodes, you spoke. Never succumb to cynicism. If you're a poet, you can't be a cynic. Bearing yourself with the etiquette of the lyrical and innocent, you found a way in wanderings. Authentic words and poems, testimonies dot that map, the continent of Yiddish, blood-soaked and staining the blotter of Europe forever. Devotional. I stand before the snow, January's talit bereft of blue stripes. The morning tassels of icicles gnarl into view. The fill in chimney tops hold to the foreheads of homes. The wind cantorial utters benedictions, urging the housed congregations who either curse or sing. Spring will be the Passover of God. A key person in my upbringing was my paternal grandmother. My maternal grandmother had died years before in Poland. And she had brought 3 sons and herself out of the war between the new emergent Polish Republic and the early Soviet state, and brought them to Warsaw, and then connected with her husband, whom she hadn't seen for almost a decade, to bring them to Canada. I remember the rituals, and now it is the period before Passover. It's interesting, I remind myself of the rituals she went through, and being the oldest male grandchild, I was always there for Shabbat and for the rituals that she performed to ensure the house was a very Jewish house indeed. Before Passover, there in the old flat, who searched at the underside of curtains, spider's dust, for the crumbs of final dinners? Rummaging for bread in 1919, grandmother gave up on fresh compost heaps, found instead sweetgrass roots to feed her brood. Later in the bustling capital, the refugees found others even trying to cheat them of the price of passage. In Canada, bread grows on trees. The children fed their big eyes and ears. In Canada, one merely picks them for the eating. Early winter nights later in Montreal, they returned from work and underpay, the snowy 3-sided shadows marching them into silence. From afar now hear the voices of aging women. Smell the shawl hugging the wizened Bubba, who never begged, but lived for the conceptions of the ordinary, bartering in the bazaars of genes and death. And if I'm going to pay tribute to my grandmother, I will to my paternal grandfather. My maternal grandfather was murdered in Bialystok at a selection, so I never did meet him. So I found the picture of him just a few months ago, and the photographs my mother brought. She left Poland a few weeks before the war broke out. There's this tallis, my grandfather's tallis, I found many years later when we cleaned up my parents' house. It was strange because it was in a big bag and it had gotten moldy. Found decades after your passing, the prayer shawl is home to millions of moths, silently incubating with no hope of a prayer to wing their way out of the dark corners of the bag. Thrown over your shoulders, it turned you into the ancient birdman to my young eyes, and with the fast murmur of your recitations, the roadrunner of holiness racing up an ascent to God. Your bones are now dust in Montreal soil, and your homes refurbished by strangers. Your tallis will soon find its rest in consecrated ground, while I scan the echo of the years for the few words you shared, though your smile and stocky, resilient frame always spoke volumes. And for those who don't know, religious objects that can't be used, we quite often, we bury them in the consecrated grounds of our cemeteries. And here's a poem to which Clinton was referring to in one of his poems, in his sonnet. One day, in the years I was living in Jerusalem, I was looking at my shoes there at the front of the house, and a whole figurative image came to mind. My shoes pray openly here at the wall. They bless naked feet, paths, sheltered streets, stairs that await, invite the dancer and the young. Pray shoes, pray worn souls, old believers. Your tongues bide the secret of those who go unknown, but hold the city from wrath and destruction. Blessing. Clean of body, scented, full and unspeaking, you hold the book, a basket of bread you break open to the salted benediction of eyes. You say a blessing. You prepare yourself for the words, for water, meat, roots, honey, and my waiting hands. One day in Jerusalem, one of my sojourns, a man knocked on the door. I couldn't tell if he was Jewish or Arab. He said a word that sounded like shoes, and I shrugged my shoulders, and I think I pulled out some lirot, this was before the shekel, and gave him some, and smiled and closed the door. Of course, I sat down and realized, as with everything else in Jerusalem, it happens in one dimension, but already one is stepping into the second dimension. Begging. At the door, the beggar wanted shoes. No money, I asked. Money too, if you have. His palm open like a plate. Shoes? What do you do with shoes? My children have feet. My children are many. They fly off in all directions. They wander from day towards night, and their feet are never still. So I shuffle from door to door. My shoes have touched more thresholds in this city of golden light than even he, the angel who comes with a sick grin and rarely dusts his feet before he comes in to snatch us, bewildered, to his smothering wings. I gave him coins and paper money and begged him to tell his partner, the angel, that this door had already been fully canvassed. Thank you. Birthday. My old co-teacher at Hebrew University, the late Shalom Nardi. Fallen in the Jewish wars, a young man who will never age shares the same prayerful eyes of ancestors and our common birth this day of May, spring's point of no return. Son and brother still he lies beneath shrubs and lettered stone. Though unknown to me, his name is on his father's lips, his face before his mother. Today, our day, celebrating, my right hand is not forgotten the cunning promise of script. The children of Abel. The children of Abel, where are they? His children's children, great-great-grandchildren, all under a simple stone, forgotten for millennia, and crying out on nights like this, the clamor of their innumerable voices amplifying and growing unbearably louder and louder. The children of Abel, where are they? And here's a poem that will tie in with one that Karen read, and I think one also that Rona read. My kind of midrash on the Isaac Ishmael story, a bit of a twist. Another son. Why does he call me Ishmael now that I've been kicked out of the family tent? First they wanted me and then got fed up caring. He took me up the mountain and lucky the angel and ram appeared in the nick of time. I was favored then and they called me Isaac. and she laughed the whole Sabbath through and half the week. But when their spirits fell, and they got tired and wouldn't let me out with the shepherds and their girls, they sent me off to Hagar's tent and told me she would be my mother now. I'm Isaac, I told the woman, Sarah's son. For me, you're Ishmael, she replied. Ishmael, that's what he calls me. And in his aging fits, who knows, he'll throw us both out into the desert while he talks to himself about another son, a perfect Isaac, subservient to his dreams. One aspect of my upbringing, of course, was the very rich and salty daily speech in Yiddish, and of course the vituperative asides that used to be heard in my family constantly. And it kind of translated itself one day to a dentist who had taken out a wisdom tooth, but had given me, or not his fault, I developed a inflammation of the jaw. And what was I to do? So I wrote a poem to him, which to this day, I think he's still practicing. In case I have to see him again, I have not shared with him. For the dentist who extracted my last wisdom tooth. Gone, it still gnaws the jaw's bone. The medic reminder where stitches are sewn. Only the law of Moses gives me sooth. Next time, sir, it's a tooth for a tooth. And while we're on vituperation, many, many years ago, as you can see from the title of the poem, this is a semi-true or almost true autobiographical poem. The bold blue couch on the balcony of my house in Old Sandy Hill disappeared one weekend. And I was rather upset. It was an old couch, but I got inordinately fond of it. How to get it back? I couldn't ask the police. It was a secondhand couch. I couldn't tell the insurance agent it was really a piece of junk, but I loved it. I began to write a series of curses, hoping that I would flush out the thief by mimeographing them or photocopying them in those days and putting them on the telephone poles all over my neighborhood. Well, I wrote the poem, but I didn't have to put it up on the porch, and I'll tell you after I finish reading it. So this was the poem for the thief or thieves. May you lie on it with a splitting headache. May you moan upon it with a migraine throbbing into full strength. May your veins bulge and your vessels swell behind your brigand's brow. May you toss and turn in excruciating torment. May you fall off and break your arms and legs in a dozen places. May you groan upon it with aching wounds and bruises and plaster casts. May you finally expire on it. May you be stretched out on it as upon your bier. May you be buried with it, the blue couch on top, so you will never crawl out to steal any other treasure. Well, the day I was going to post it, at noontime, I heard noise on my front balcony, and there were two students carrying up my blue couch. And I came out astonished and said, well, hey, you brought it back, how come? And one of them said to me, I don't know, he said, but I brought it back because I've been feeling for hours that something terrible was going to happen to me. And that is a true story. And here is a poem to my father. In many ways, it's in dialogue with A.M. Klein's famous poem to his father called Heirloom. Real estate. My father passed on no faithful piety. Whomever he may have addressed in prayer, the name was never bequeathed in letter or will. Nor did he let on who sent his guardian angel to wave his way when he was barely tall, from the ripe horizon of a field of high grain. Out there he was safe in sun or beating rain. He never forgot those pear trees hung with succulent gold, and the maturing soil yielding what was tastiest from his distant corner of Ukraine. Here in his last town, Montreal, he held no plot dearer than his backyard, his row of tomato plants and cucumbers inching forward in green formation to a briny fate. who will tend with the same devotion his final real estate in the La Savane, claimed as it will be to the end with his bare chiseled name. And for balance, a poem for my mother. Mother's Day. You never absolved yourself of your own mother's weak heart that left you orphaned at age 5. Suddenly, in the midst of your first schooling, they took her off to the fearsome capital where big doctors promised to reblush her pale smile. But there they soon buried her beneath a blatant stone. Mother, it's Mother's Day, 80 years later, and the Warsaw Cemetery that outlasted the murderous Nazi enemy is now as overgrown and entangled as your aged brain. Only broken sentences like thin branches tremble in the mind, and all your quick stories lie embedded now in stone-covered forgetfulness or silence. For the past 20 years, I've been working with a form called the word sonnet, a short, thin subverse of 14 words, 1 word per line. I'm going to skip a bit because of time frame, and I hope you can follow me. I'm going to go to the first one I'm going to read will be September Rain. So I don't know who's managing the manuscripts. We're going on to the second one, September Rain. If the maple trees could, they would dream of the healing entrance of May. December flight. These starlings swerve in flocks, turning their frantic wings towards the sun's slanting light. Yiddish. Echo of whisper as distant ghosts in their millions dream the living into speech. Day, from my friend Adam Furstenberg, Zichrono Levacha. Blessed is the light that returns, renewing the day different from all other days. And the title poem of my new book, Perfume. Let's lobby God. Keep the angels out of it and their union leaders. Don't let the devils out of the basement. Just find out God's working hours and confront the divine on her way home. Enough with destruction, war, and suffering. Let the world continue to flower all year long, and let death be only the perfume that dispels vanity and disease power. So at this point, I want to thank my fellow poets for their reading, and we are going to open up a discussion whereby questions can be raised and directed towards any one of us. And if we all unmute, we can also do what is so very Jewish, interrupt each other as we speak in order to get our points across. So who is going to send in the questions? I don't see any question here. The questions are...
Seymour, you just need to open your question and answer window and you will see all the questions.
Well, I only see 2 questions. They are directive questions. Rather than questions we have to answer, they're telling us what we could do. One person would like to see us do this every few months. Gesinterheit. We can do it every few months. We can add some more people. We can do the same people, you know. And the other person has another suggestion about what we could write. But does anyone have something a little more specific about something we read?
You can click on the answered questions. You will see 3 more.
Pardon?
Click on the answered tab on the top of the question and answer. You should see 3 more questions.
Yeah, I have 3 questions. I have 3. The third one is rather interesting. Maybe any one of my readers could answer it. There's a question from one reader, one member of the audience. Are all your poems based on the scripture or scriptures?
I can give, can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you, but I don't know about the rest. But our technical team will definitely tell us. Everyone hear us, right?
Yes, no, not all of my poems are based on scriptures. I only read one today that's based on scriptures, but I have other ones and I have some in the works. And I was interested to see how many of the other readers also wrote poems based on scriptures. So perhaps this is a theme in amongst us Canadian Jewish poets.
I would agree with you. It's something you can't escape. No matter what our education has been, we've all encountered scriptures and we've written about it. I'll give you some shameless promotion. As a year ago, a book came out, a bilingual book of my biblical poems called The Chant de Moïse, the Song of Moses. It is a series of 20 poems based on the Hebrew scriptures, specifically the first 2 books of the Bible, of the 5 books of Moses, and it's in a bilingual edition. All my original poems were translated by one of my translators, and it's available from Mémoire d'Encrier, a publisher from Montreal. So you can have both the English and the French. There have been, one person is asking, since this is billed as chapter 1, when might we hope to see future chapters? With God's help, we hope to do this. I would love to be able to do this every 3 to 4 months and add maybe new poets. And then maybe the end, I have an idea that after 12 poets, I had this absolutely wild idea today to go to my publisher and say, how about bringing out an anthology of 12 poets and all the poems they've read in this series with Limmud. So I don't know if he's listening in today, but I'll be chatting with him about it. So one person has a question which I'd like perhaps the others to answer. When can we stop doing poems about the Holocaust? There have been other pains since then that have caused carnage in modern wars.
If I can chime in, that's an interesting question. I mean, what's interesting for me about the Holocaust is how problematic it is to attempt to fashion any kind of imaginary creative work out of it, right? I mean, in any way. And I've tried in my writing in various forms to you can't use the word use the Holocaust, obviously, but refer to the Holocaust and relate to the Holocaust in a certain way, and both in poetry and fiction, but it is fundamentally a problematic issue, right? I mean, when you start creating and imagining what people went through during the Holocaust, it becomes rife with it's a fraught issue. It's an unavoidable, both an unavoidable and fraught issue for the Jewish experience. So I wonder how, as writers, the rest of the panelists approach that problem. I've faced it in a number of ways, and it's not been easy. My first novel had a character who was a Holocaust survivor, and it was very problematic. So I don't know how the other panelists feel about this idea of referring to the Holocaust.
I mean, I would say that I've only written a few poems that have been, in quote, inspired by the Holocaust, mostly by neighbors who were living on the same street that I grew up in. And the question says, there have been other pains since and that have caused carnage in modern wars. I would answer that question very politically. I mean, right now in Canada, if you are a literary person, you are not supposed to appropriate other cultures. So actually, as writers, we are being advised not to write about other people's pains, but to allow their voices to express their own pains. So I, as a writer, would hesitate right now, even though I disagree with that, I would hesitate right now to write about somebody else's experience of pain, partly for fear of being chastised about that. So maybe that's why Jewish writers and people now are writing more about their own experience.
But you're fundamentally right. I mean, when I think about it, there's one of the books that that was meaningful for me was by a Jewish Canadian poet named Kenneth Sherman, and he wrote a book called Words for Elephant Man. So this idea that you can go into the mind of someone else and try to imagine their experience. I don't remember which poet wrote from the point of view of the biblical character Ruth, right? Or you know, you have to do this. This is what writers do, is to take, you know, yeah, go ahead. I don't want to.
No, I agree completely. I don't think that a writer can, you know, arbitrarily be told you can't write about this or you can't write about that. I mean, then can a man write about a woman? Can a woman write about a man? I mean, where does it stop? And I think that in terms of Jewish writers writing about the Holocaust, it's not as if we're only writing about the Holocaust, but it is a very significant and major part of our experience, which we can't ignore. It doesn't mean we ignore the rest of the suffering and pain historically. So,
yeah, I mean, I haven't written much about the Holocaust, and not all of my writing is about, much of my writing actually is not about Jewish experience, or not all of it is. Yeah. I mean, I tend to write about what's going on in my life, and so my latest book doesn't have hardly any poems of Jewish themes, and my whole life I've been with partners who aren't Jewish, so I tend to write also from a broader experience.
I would say, sorry, Karen.
No.
Sorry. I would say the same for me. And I think, look, you know, who knows what triggers a poem for a writer? You know, the same thing that I see, or that Seymour or Karen or Glenn sees, may not trigger them, but it may trigger me, you know, vice versa. So, I mean, I think part of the mystery of writing is, why does something trigger you versus me? And then, you know, taking it more broadly, how do those listening or reading it react to it? Yeah. Hopefully there's a resonance, you know, beyond our individual experience.
Well, I had no choice. If you heard my poems, my mother was the last of her family to leave Poland 29 days before the war broke out. She was one of the 327 Jews permitted into Canada in 1939, brought by her two half-sisters. Everyone except one brother was murdered in Poland in the death camps or in the marches. So it was part of our family experience. When the days to say Yisker, my mother had pictures of her family, and she always used to say to me in Yiddish, "Efnuf the Siddur Farmir," open up the Siddur, find the Yisker, because she was crying all day. So it's very much part of my experience. It was there for my mother in front of her all the time. And I could not escape it and run away from it. And then when I went to Poland, one of my sole trip, I tried to find my grandmother's, well, her mother had died before the Holocaust, tried to find my grandmother's grave, which I wasn't successful doing, tried to follow part of the family, but it was there. And this huge hole, because on my father's side, they had all come before World War I, after World War I. There was a big extended family. But on my mother's side, there was a hole. There was only one full brother. She had, as I discovered, I mentioned earlier, I found my maternal grandfather's photo a few weeks ago and sent it to my brother who lives in Israel because he's named after him. There was my mother's was the youngest of three who came out of a blended family. My mother never pointed this out to me, but her older sister, who's there, I know, died in the burning of the Bialystok synagogue in June 1941, when the Nazis and Polish collaborators pushed 3,000 people into a synagogue and set it alight. She died with her young daughter, after whom I'm named, and her husband. Other members of the family, they don't know, my grandfather, but this was part of my mother's world. So I couldn't close it out. And then my sole uncle who survived, because he was captured by the Russians, he married a Holocaust survivor later on. And so it was still part of the family, but it was not part of my father's family. That's interesting. Though they've lost touch with their family in Ukraine, many of whom may have been killed in Babi Yar, we don't know. But they didn't have contact with them throughout from the mid-30s on. I'm trying to piece it all together. So I had no choice, because I write the things that touch me, move me, and I had to write out of these things. But I have one poem called The Children of Abel, and it's for all the innocents who die. All the innocents who die, no matter if they're Jewish, not Jewish, the innocents who are killed every day in the terrible wars and fighting and struggles and conflicts that go on as we talk here, are going on in different parts of the world. There are just too many innocents who died, and their projected offspring will never come into being, which struck me that day when I wrote that poem. There is another question from Anita Schwartzberg about, she went to the Winchesky School. She mentioned a teacher, I think she's meaning Shalom Stern, the Yiddish poet. Yeah. And there are a number of editions of his poems in English, especially I think one or two of his longer novels in verse, which you can find in the library, or check out the Jewish Public Library's catalog. He may have taught you, if you remember. Yes. I never translated Sholom's poems, though I know that every few months when I was in Ottawa, when I arrived, he used to call me in my office and try to get me interested in his work. He wanted to be translated and read, but he got translated and read. And he was a teacher, a kind of itinerant teacher, because he went to people's homes and taught people. I think my wife told me that for a year or two, he taught her the Aleph Bes when her parents hired him to come to the house and teach, you know.
There was a question. There's a question I see from Anshel Koshetsky. Did any of Klein's children pursue a literary life?
Oh, let me go and find it. I'm a little bit behind here. Yes. Did any of Klein's children pursue a literary life? Good question.
I have the answer. Well, A.M. Klein was a lawyer by training, and his two sons, Coleman and Sander, are also lawyers. And he had a daughter who tragically died by suicide. So his two living children are lawyers. They're still practicing lawyers. And in fact, his granddaughter is a lawyer. Is a professor of law at McGill. And I know this because she was a teacher of my daughter, who's in the law program at McGill.
Here's a good question. There's two questions here. One from Rhoda Atwood, another one from Vivian Ohana. The first one is, how have the restrictions imposed by COVID affected your writing? And then along with it was the other question, what about writing about this pandemic that all the world is facing? So here we get the question the poets face. People say, why don't you write about this? And I leave it to the poets to answer that.
Okay. I did write, I have written, I did write one pandemic poem, and it was read by a BBC voiceover guy, actually, early on in the pandemic. I tend to write about things long after they happen. So I'm sure I will write more about it. I'm kind of like Wordsworth. I write about even experiences, even my travel experiences. I sometimes write about them 10 years later. It's just my style. But I did write a COVID poem. COVID hasn't affected my writing life that much because I've always written and worked predominantly in my life from home. So my working life is not that much changed from the pandemic, more my social life.
Yeah. I would echo that. I don't think I've written a specific poem about COVID, but it does kind of hover on the fringes of my writing. And one of the poems I read could be, I guess, interpreted as a COVID poem where I say, can you leave your place of beige? But it wasn't necessarily intended like that. But if it has that resonance, that's great. I think for writers who write seriously, COVID has kind of been a gift in a sense, in that I don't mean the actual COVID is a gift, but the isolation that it produced, certainly was an incentive to do more writing. I just wish we hadn't had to have that incentive, with so much suffering around us. But yeah.
I would add that the poet is not a journalist.
Right.
We don't have to write every day about what's happening. It's a creative process of thing. And when something presses on our consciousness, someone comes up in our unconscious, finds a rhythm and sound and words. It could be an experience we had 25 years ago, 7 days ago. And I'm sure that all of us have experienced the pandemic. I also have written a few short poems, you can't help but write them, but I don't feel that our responsibility is to write about what's happening right now. Then sometimes you write more powerfully when you have some time, a distance to see it in some kind of context, when it's worked its way into your unconscious and it's come out again into your creativity. So as I said, there will be poems. I'm sure there are people who are going to write. I'm sure there's going to be novels coming out of this period. And I'm sure each one of us, some or other, there'll be a reflection of it. But I don't think you can immediately write out of something just because you experienced it. You do need time to have those elements of your psyche work through it in order to be able to reshape it into a creative form.
And I'll make one comment about, rather than writing poems, actually it's changed my reading. I find that I'm reading a lot more poetry during this period of time. I don't know why, but for a while I was not reading a lot of poetry. And since COVID, I've actually turned to poetry and have started reading more poetry, and particularly love poems, the poems that bring us closer together.
That's really nice. I just wanted to add a thought to Seymour, to what you had said. It may be that we don't write a poem that is directly about COVID, but maybe the atmosphere that's been created by COVID, be it fear, death, isolation, you name it, stimulates poems along those themes. So it may not have the title COVID, but it just may have that, resonance may find its way into our work.
One person is, I'm skipping a bit, I'm not going exactly in order. One person would like to know how to reach us. I don't know which person she wants to reach. It looks like it is, if I'm right, the playwright Aviva Ravel who asked that question. All you have to do is write to Limmud Ottawa and ask for your message to be sent on to one of the poets. As far as I'm concerned, I can't hide on the internet. I am still attached to the University of Ottawa as an Emeritus professor, so there's a profile on me. My office email is given, my telephone number is given, my fax is given, so I can never hide under a bush. The other poets are lucky, they're not attached to any institution, so you may have to work a little harder to find them. But if you want to reach any of the poets, you have anything interesting to share with them, please, I'm sure they'll be happy. Writers just love to get inquiries from people. It's not that we get inquiries day in, day out, but we're very happy to inquire. We're not international stars, but we do definitely appreciate when people ask questions. There are all kinds of other questions here. We can keep on going. I don't know what my time limit is with the, there's one question here thanking us and wants to know what's inspiring us. And well, I don't know what to speak to the others. I read you work that's been published, that's been completed, that's been done up to years ago. And of course, what I've done in the past few months is not reflected in that work. I just selected works from many years of writing, just I thought would be useful. And some of the questions also, people wanted optimism. Well, there was some optimism in all of us. But since we're Jewish, our optimism is always, in a way, compromised by tears. We laugh and cry at the same time because of our culture, our history, which each one of us has taken into ourselves. So that's my answer to one of the questions we had. Anyone want to comment on that?
I was going to say the same thing, which is that there's a little bit of laughter in the tears, and they're both two sides of the same coin. So that's
the broken glass.
Yes,
the
broken glass. Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, I purposely read poems with, I started out with more serious ones and then read poems with humor in them. You know, my Zayden and the strippers.
Yeah, but I'm to blame as the shamus of this congregation of four. I asked them to think of Jewish themes because it was Limmud, and I think that Jewish writers should not be ashamed of writing about out of their own experience. The thing I always had arguments with my distant cousin Mordecai Ritzler about that. If it's part of your experience, you know, and this is what I thought, want people to share right away. We all write other poems too, you know, but in this case, the four of us and the poems that we offered you all, it was interesting response to our own lives as Jewish Canadians, about what really touches us, what moves us, what we have to say. It's there, and I'm really grateful that the poets agreed to join me, and I'm grateful for the over 100 people who signed up today to listen to this.
There's a question about, I don't mean to interrupt you, Seymour. There's a question about that I find interesting about which books of poetry would be suggested, that we might suggest. But actually, one of the things that I wanted to ask, and maybe I'll put it out there for everybody, is this idea, this discussion of, at some point in, but a generation ago, and I think maybe Seymour suggested it, Jewish writers were really at the center of everything that was happening in Canada, both prose and poetry, you know, whether we're talking about Leighton or Cohen or Mayne or Richler, and it seems to we've gone into the mainstream. We're no longer, in a way, the subject du jour or the writers du jour, you know. And I wonder if, like, if somebody asked me which poets would I suggest, I would say, yeah, go back and read Klein, and go back and read Leighton, and go back. Well, I mean, Leonard, everybody reads Leonard, right? So, but that's what I would suggest.
And I would say read Shenfeld and read Shaffran and read Rotchin. Because I think it's time everyone's read them. Read the newer writers, you know, look at the new work that they've done. And I think that your work stands side by side with everything is published. I read the journals, and there's something I noticed in all three of you, which is something I hold dear. You write with a sense of craft, how to shape a poem. You're sensitive to the language, to what it says, how it sounds as poems. And you're also write with an understanding that you're going to share what you write, and you're going to move people with it. As it moves you to write it, you will move others to share with it. And sometimes, and a lot of the poetry written in Canadian magazines today is very, I call it selfie verbalism. People are just turned in on them very small circumference of their bodies and the few of their physical experiences. They don't seem to want to connect with anything larger than themselves. So it's a very narrow world. I want to say that poets I read in other cultures from other languages, they haven't gone that way. In North America, maybe because the strong American influence on Canada, we become too individualistic in our writing and our concerns, you know, and sometimes to absurd degrees, you know.
I think there's also, Seymour, like there are micro communities of poets, because there are slam poets, spoken word poets, language poets, like people writing in sort of postmodern, very academic kind of style poets. There actually is tons and tons of poetry out there, and tons being published. So I think the lover of poetry actually has an abundant cornucopia to choose from, and can just choose the kind of poetry that he or she likes. I mean, I have poetry books all over my table. I mean, they're not necessarily Jewish poets, but I have James Deal's book that he just sent to me. He's a fine Canadian poet who was actually married to a Jewish woman named Gilda, and wrote very beautiful poems about her, love poems and poems in mourning. And then I have an old book by Derek Walcott, The Star Apple Kingdom. which I think it might be his first book of poetry, who is a poet from St. Lucia. I mean, I have hundreds and hundreds of poetry books all over that I constantly turn
Karen,
to.
thank you. Seymour, Karen, Rona, oh my God, Glenn. I mean, this was superb. And I think we definitely were going to have chapter 2 and can pick up the conversation from there. Okay, we can't thank you enough. And we always go over, this is also very Jewish, but you know, everything does come to the end. And I just wanted to acknowledge a few people here who have made this all possible. And of course, our fabulous Limmud team for listening to our amazing Zoom webinar maven and technical advisor is Alexandre Matt. And we will do this again. And I just wanted to make sure that you will find everything, hopefully everything, on our website. And if you want to see more programs like this, please fill out the questionnaire you will receive. And then we will have an idea what kind of innovation and what kind of meaningful learning opportunities we can create for you. This is all for the community. And again, we remind you to please consider a donation to Ottawa's Kosher Food Bank. It is Passover and it has been an extremely difficult year for so many. And from our families to your families, we wish everyone a healthy and a meaningful Passover. And we do look forward to see you next time at Limmud Ottawa. Litraot shana ba belimud. Thank you, everyone. This was amazing. And I'm going to ask everybody to come on the screen. Alexandra, I'm going to, where are my poets? Where are they? Hello? Yes, come. Everybody join the screen. And we're going to wave goodbye.
It's too bad we can't do the horror together. That's it.
No,
That's
not this
Yeah.
time. Not
I can't
this time.
seem to.
Next
I
time.
can't seem to get that. Somebody has stopped my video. I think Alexandra.
No, I think Alexandra is trying to get the. Yeah.
Girl, there you are. Girl, help.
Oh, there.
Where are you?
Bye,
Bye,
everyone.
everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everybody.
you.
It was so great.
Thank
Shalom.
you. This was
Shalom.
marvelous. Thank you. We will
Shalom.
be back.